So we have been going through, here's the story where we are going through the parables of Jesus. And there are a lot of them, in case you can't tell already. We're not even going to be covering all of them through this whole series, but this morning we'll be in Matthew chapter 18. If you haven't turned to it already, you want to follow along that way. And we're actually going to just jump right into it, but I'm going to do something a little bit different this morning. I'm actually going to start this story halfway through. And there's a point to that, and that's not to say that Jesus wasn't a good storyteller and told things out of order, but I think it's worth telling a little bit out of order to kind of get a fresh perspective on this. So we're actually going to start in verse 28, about halfway through verse 28. A man went to a fellow servant who owed him a few $1,000s. He grabbed him by the throat and demanded instant payment. His fellow servant fell down before him and begged for a little more time. "Be patient with me, and I will pay it," he pleaded. But his creditor wouldn't wait. He had the man arrested and put in prison until the debt could be paid in full. So the amount here that we're seeing, it says a few thousand. The original text says 100 denarii. And so if you were here last week or watched online, you may remember that denarii is 1 day's wage. So we're talking about 3 to 4 months worth of wages. This is not a small sum by any means, right? So even keeping in mind, it wouldn't take 3 to 4 months to pay this off. It would take longer because obviously this man would have to make a living for himself, for his family, and pay bills and everything like that. So this is not an insignificant amount of debt that's being owed here. And so one thing to keep in mind here, you can see that they're both servants. They say fellow servants. So during the age of Jesus, about 95% of people had some sort of debt. There was just a lot of poverty at this time. A lot of people would owe. It would be generational debt that would be owed at times as well. So it's not out of the ordinary for there to be someone who owes to someone else who also owes to someone else. So surely this man who has this debt owed to him must have his own bills to pay, right? He's a debtor himself. So it kind of makes sense. And if we hear the story in this order and we start with this, it might make sense to us of, okay, maybe the grabbing by the throat's a little extreme, right? That's a little out of line, potentially. But it stands to reason that this guy has his own debts, he has his own bills to pay, he has his own family to provide for. It's reasonable that he would ask this other man to have something paid back. You'll see here, the parables are standalone, but there are recurring themes that happen here. And so this is Jesus telling this story. And he uses imagery of, you'll see, of a garden or of money. He uses those a lot. It makes sense because he knew in his infinite wisdom that even today, 2025, two of our biggest priorities would be money and food, right? Like, of course, they're necessities. Think of the things that you worry about the most, probably money and food. Money is probably like the bigger thing, like how am I going to pay these bills, any number of things. How much, am I going to get a raise at my job? There's different things to worry about with that. Food could just be, what am I going to have for lunch? And maybe that's what you think about when I'm up here talking is, what am I going to have for lunch? When is this guy going to be done? When do we get to eat? These are things that we kind of worry about the most. And so it makes sense that Jesus would use this. And even back in that day, that was something that people really worried about. Debt makes sense in this story because Jesus is talking about forgiveness, and so something owed, when we think about forgiveness, there's really some sort of penance that needs to be paid to a person. There's something that's owed. And when we're forgiving, we're essentially erasing that debt. So let's put a little more context into this portion of the story and even go back just a little bit further in Matthew 18. Because if you look at how this story starts in verse 21, you'll see that it starts with then. So again, we want to look at context when it has that sort of start to it. So right before this, in Matthew 18, Jesus is talking about this idea of a brother sinning against a brother. So if you ever hear, like, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, it comes from this passage here. It's talking specifically about forgiveness and restoration, reconciliation. It goes through the different steps of what that looks like. And so that's a model that we use even to this day of how do we address things when people sin against us? How do we as Christians handle that? We first try to work it out with them, and then we bring two brothers or sisters in Christ to work it out that way. Then there's church leadership, and if all else fails, then we tried. We did our due diligence, right? So he talks about this whole process, and then Peter, which, again, parallel to last week, there's a lot of times that Peter really was the voice of the disciples and was the one that, spoke up and had the doubts and the questions and things like that. He asked a question about how many times should we forgive? And that's in verse 21 here. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how often should I forgive someone who sins against me? 7 times? No, not 7 times, Jesus replied, but 70 times 7. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who decided to bring his accounts up to date with servants who had borrowed money from him. In the process, one of his debtors was brought in who owed him millions of dollars. He couldn't pay, so his master ordered that he be sold, along with his wife, his children, and everything he owed, to pay the debt. But the man fell down before his master and begged him, Please be patient with me, and I will pay it all. Then his master was filled with pity for him, and he released him and forgave his debt. 7 times 7. We're actually not even sure potentially what this could mean is 7 times 70. Jesus is putting this big number out here, and even though this parable in particular is unique to Matthew, we do see this interaction of this question and the answer that it starts with in Luke as well. And in Luke's account of it, Jesus even says 7 times 7 or 7 times 70 daily. So really we're seeing this hyperbole at this point. Like Jesus is exaggerating. He's just kind of saying this number like you're forgiving constantly. And then he goes into this story and he starts with, once again, another parallel to last week. The kingdom of heaven is like. So again, saying, hey, I know what the reality is down here. I know how things operate here. But in my kingdom that I'm bringing here to you, this is how things work. And forgiveness is something that happens regularly in my kingdom. So what's interesting to note here, it says millions of dollars, but I want to break it down again into the original wording here. So we're talking about 100 denarii, previously what we heard, so about 100 days. In this account here, the literal translation is 10,000 talents. So whereas a denarii is 1 day's wage, a talent was about 20 years worth of wages. So we're talking 10,000 20 years worth of wages. You can do the math here, right? What's interesting you do the calculation here, it's about 200,000 essentially, or excuse me, 200, I can't even do the math at this point. It doesn't even matter. I had it written somewhere here, I've lost it. Again, it's hyperbole at this point. But what's interesting to note about this number that's given here is that there are historical records that have been found of what the annual tribute was in the area for the different nations, and they found that was about 600 talents. So this debt that was owed was far greater, over 10 times greater, than what was actually the money in circulation at the time. This was an incredible debt. Not only that, 10,000 was chosen for a reason because it's the highest number in Greek. I don't know if they just gave up and like, when are we ever going to count higher than 10,000? So the Greek were like, all right, that's the highest, right? So Jesus is using the highest number that exists in the Greek language, and he's using the highest denomination, a talent. So it's the greatest number of the highest denomination that's owed. So even though this says millions, a more accurate modern day translation would be infinity bajillion dollars is what would be owed at this point. Just a crazy high amount of this. So this likely would have involved some sort of scam. Like this, something was going on with the books, like, they were reviewing it and they find something. So clearly this person who owed this debt was doing something wrong. It wasn't just coming back and being aware of his debt, and he had no intention of paying this. He probably did some sort of lying and cheating in order to get the amount that he got. So clearly something was wrong here. And so the king considers that he's going to sell this man and his family into slavery, which sounds harsh, and indeed it is. This was something that happened back in the day. Sometimes fathers would have debts, and they would sell their sons into slavery to help pay for that debt. So just to and I know it's kind of weird to think about this, of how much would a slave be worth, but it's important to look at the numbers here. Like a top-of-the-line slave, like, the best of the best, the young, like I'm a brand new laborer about to start, would be worth about 1 talent. So that's the top end here at this point. And what was really sad about this, you'll remember that it was 20 years worth of wages. Well, this was chosen for a reason. There's a reason that a slave at their prime would be worth 1 talent. Their life expectancy, once they went into manual labor, went into slave labor, was 20 years. So that talent isn't just 20 years out of nowhere. This is the lifetime. This is like what we're expecting this slave to give you, is 20 years worth of work. It's a lifetime of work. So this man, just an impossible amount to be able to pay. And so why jail? Why is this a thing that's even on the table of selling him or going to jail? Kind of think of it maybe as a modern equivalent of a loan repayment plan, right? There are some times where a bank or a financial institution, someone will owe such a high debt that they'll just be like, okay, let's get what we can get out of this person, right? So they might take a very low seemingly payment plan of like 50 to $100 a month, or even lower than that, just because it's better than nothing, right? They're trying to recoup their losses. And so maybe that's what's going on here. But God isn't just a banker. He is a king with a full right to repayment. He has every right to throw this man into jail for the rest of his life, to throw the family into jail for the rest of their lives because of this amount that's owed. But this man begs, and the verbiage here is that he fell prostrate. So he's like really just embarrassing himself, like humbling himself fully on the ground, splayed out, begging, pleading, probably crying, please be patient with me. We heard that in the verse earlier today, to be patient with each other. Here he is asking for this patience. Please, I will pay it back. I'll pay all of it back. How could he do that? Not sure about that, but he's desperate. But this king, he doesn't work out a repayment plan. He has 3 levels of this compassion that he shows on this man. First, he has mercy. He actually relates to this man. He has mercy upon him. And he doesn't send him to jail. He doesn't immediately send him off and say, oh, okay, well, you can just pay it off as you're able to. No, he even goes a step further, a 3rd step, and forgives the full amount of debt. Says it is completely wiped clean. You are forgiven of all of it. Let's read verse 28 again. When the man left the king, he went to a fellow servant who owed him a few $1,000s. He grabbed him by the throat and demanded instant payment. His fellow servant fell down before him and begged for a little more time. Be patient with me, and I will pay it. Sound familiar? He pleaded, but his creditor wouldn't wait. He had the man arrested and put in prison until the debt could be paid in full. 3 to 4 months' wages is a lot, right? If you're thinking about someone who maybe owes you money, or maybe you owe money, like 3 to 4 months' wage, that's still a lot. But suddenly it feels pretty minuscule, doesn't it? When within the context of this story, of this impossibly large number that was forgiven to this man. And so suddenly this approach where we have, okay, maybe this sounds a little bit reasonable, suddenly doesn't have any reason to it whatsoever. Are you serious? Like, this man is literally owing you 1/600,000th of your debt that you were forgiven. 1/600,000th of the debt. In fact, there's no conversation here about selling this man into another slave or anything like that, because the amount that this other slave owns is less than his worth, right? So legally, he couldn't be sold to pay this debt because he owes less than his value as a slave. And yet, here is this initial servant saying, nope, not good enough. Be patient with me and I will pay it. He even hears the same words that he begged the king earlier. But he was still keeping score. And this is evidence of a heart issue. There was no real repentance that was shown here in the original servant here. He was just glad to be off the hook. This initial servant was relieved, but he was not transformed. He was relieved of his debt, but he didn't feel the transformation of that. He didn't have a heart that would extend that same forgiveness and that same kindness. I know it's easy to kind of put it in this framework, and please understand, I'm not trying to dismiss any sort of issues of forgiveness that, or lack of forgiveness that maybe you owe to someone at some point. Not even owe, I should say. But maybe there's someone that you've withheld forgiveness from, and you're struggling with that, and you're like, okay, I understand. I've done a lot of horrible things, and I can't even comprehend the forgiveness that God has given me. But when we withhold this forgiveness, we step into the opposite of that, which is bitterness. And bitterness is poison to the body. Hebrews even says the root of bitterness defiles us. It defiles others in the community around us. So when we're withholding forgiveness, we're ruining ourselves. The moment we stop forgiving, we start destroying. Start destroying relationships. Even with those around us, we start destroying ourselves. We start destroying this beautiful thing of forgiveness that God has for us. And there are consequences for it. We read about this as we continue and finish this story in verse 31. When some of the other servants saw this, they were very upset. They went to the king and told him everything that had happened. Then the king called in the man he had forgiven and said, "You evil servant, I forgave you that tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant just as I had mercy on you?" Then the angry king sent the man to prison to be tortured until he had paid his entire debt. That's what my heavenly Father will do to you if you refuse to forgive your brothers and sisters from your heart. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. It's right there in the Lord's Prayer. What if that were true? Or maybe another question is, what if the forgiveness that I withhold in my own life for other people was also forgiveness that God withheld from me? You see, we can't receive unlimited forgiveness and then put limits on it with others. And so what we see here is retributive justice. It's outside of the kingdom ethic to withhold this forgiveness. One of my first sermons that I preached here was talking about love and not withholding love, and experiencing God's love will cause you to express that to others. And part of that is forgiveness. When you experience God's forgiveness and you have that fully committed into your heart, as it even says here, forgive your brothers and sisters from your heart, that extends to others. And when we don't do that, there are dire consequences because we are living outside of Jesus' kingdom ethic. It talks about this torment here, and you could interpret it any number of ways. Is there a literal torment that happens from this? Maybe. But really, there's a figurative kind of self-inflicted torment that happens also. Lewis Smead says, to forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover that the prisoner was you. To forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover that the prisoner was you. When we withhold forgiveness, maybe a little bit we're punishing the person that has wronged us, but ultimately we are punishing ourselves. Back in 2006, there was a school in West Nichols called the West Nichols Mines School. It was a small town in Pennsylvania, mostly an Amish community. And in this little schoolhouse, there was a shooting. It's to date, I believe, the largest school shooting still in Pennsylvania, where a man went into the schoolhouse. He sent everyone out except for the girls and shot 10 of them, killing most of them. And then he turned the gun on himself. And the response from the Amish community was something that was incredible. They had actually worked with this man. He had a working relationship with the Amish community. And through the notes that he left, they discovered, obviously, clearly something very wrong with him, but he was lamenting a death that had happened. He had lost his daughter about 20 years prior. And he was angry at God, he was angry at people, and so he targeted these young girls out of this evilness in his heart. But this Amish community made news not just because of this shooting, which unfortunately is far too common in the news, but because of their response to it. Literally the day of the shooting, there were people from the Amish community who went to the widow of the shooter and were with her and were consoling her and were walking alongside her. There was one Amish man who held the father of the shooter and held him while he sobbed. They invested and they forgave almost immediately. Some of the quotes that they had from some of the people that they interviewed was, one man said, "We must not think evil of this man," said one of the grandparents of a victim. Another man said, "He had a mother and a wife and a soul, and now he's standing before a just God." This is a story that made national attention. They even have a book and a movie about it. It's this incredible, powerful story of forgiveness. And from this, and actually I should even say one more thing, is 30 of the Amish community attended this man's funeral. And from this, the widow wrote this to the Amish community: "Your love for our family has helped to provide the healing we so desperately need. Gifts you've given have touched our hearts in a way no words can describe. Your compassion has reached beyond our family, beyond our community, and is changing our world. And for this, we sincerely thank you." Changing the world. Well, when the world heard about this, there were some pundits that had opinions on this, and rightfully so to an extent. There was this criticism of the response of why would the Amish people respond this way? It almost negated the severity of the situation, right? Like they were downplaying it. But here's the three important things about forgiveness here that I'll say. Forgiveness is not an endorsement of wrongdoing. Just because you forgive someone does not mean you're saying, it's okay, right? Sometimes we'll say that when we forgive, like, oh, it's okay. No, we're not saying that what happened was okay. Forgiveness isn't minimizing the damage done. The damage that's been done to us, any number of us could tell these stories. Maybe you don't have one that's as heart-wrenching as this story of the Amish community, and I don't mean to say this to diminish any pain that you've had. You probably have very powerful stories of ways that you've been hurt by people or communities or churches or any number of sources. Forgiveness does not minimize the damage done. The debt that was owed by the other debtor was still a significant amount. And finally, forgiveness isn't putting yourself in an abusive situation. It's not going back and saying, okay, we're going to be buddies now. We're going to be reconciled to the point where I'm inviting more. No, please understand that if there's an abusive situation, it doesn't mean run back to it. But what forgiveness really is a kingdom mindset that doesn't make earthly sense. It didn't make sense to the public when these Amish people were forgiving. It doesn't make sense when there are people in our lives that we are called to forgive and we extend that to them. Going back to this parable here, we see this man's reaction, this initial servant, this initial debtor. His reaction to the person who owed him money was emotional, right? It was a knee-jerk response. He was vengeful. He was violent about it. What's interesting is the king's reaction was emotional as well. I mentioned a little bit earlier that he took pity. But the words used here, filled with pity, it's the same phrase that Jesus, that was used to explain the account of when Jesus would see people who were hurt, who were broken, who were sick, who were poor, who were ignored by society. It is the same word that he was so moved. This extreme level of not even just sympathy, but empathy for broken people. This is what the king had for this servant. And we can look at this initial response to put a man in jail, even though the value was less than his debt, and we might think, okay, maybe this is a repayment plan. But I think, as we're looking at this, maybe the king saw more value in this man than the world saw. Maybe there was something more there. Maybe he saw, you know what, as much as it's bajillions worth of debt that he owes, I still see more value in this person than I do in his debt. I love how Dwight Moody words this. The voice of sin is loud, but the voice of forgiveness is louder. What a powerful word. I know this is a challenge. I know this is supposed to be, it's summer fun, right? Nice, easygoing message. But these are the words of God. And believe me, whenever I preach, I try to preach to myself. And this is one that I'm still struggling with. So you'll have to forgive me that I am before you as a hypocrite. Because there is pain in my heart that I'm not always forgiving of. And sometimes that 7 times 70 isn't for new occurrences of pain. It's for the same one that crops up again. And daily I'm having to choose to forgive even that same transgression. So I would encourage you, you've probably already been thinking about it as we go through this story here. What are the areas where you need to forgive others? To look into your heart and look at the ways that you've been forgiven. Ultimately by God, maybe by other followers, or even people who just love you enough, and by the promptings of God, even without a relationship of God, they still forgive you, right? Whatever forgiveness looks like for you, but ultimately, we have such a large debt that has been completely wiped clean. And who are we to hold this debt against anyone else? So I encourage you as we go into a time of prayer here to search your heart, to look for ways that you're holding these grudges, that you're holding these debts against people that you shouldn't be holding because God has forgiven you. God, we come before you trying to take the posture of having a heart of forgiven followers of you. Not to be stubborn, but to see what you have done for us. God, it's so easy to react emotionally in the moment to maybe a wrong that's happening at that time, or maybe it's just something that triggers and brings something up, something horrible that's been done to us. God, first of all, you see that pain. You know it. You don't condone it. You don't minimize it. You were there in that pain with us. You feel what we feel, and you walk alongside us. Even though we caused that pain to you, even though we've caused even greater pain to you, we owe such a more significant debt to you, Lord. You are still with us, and you are still beside us, and you still love us. God, from that forgiveness, we pray, we claim that would be a wellspring, that would be a font of forgiveness that flows from us. That we would be able to have the humility and the grace and the mercy and the love to let go and give that over to you to forgive. Maybe it's a one-time thing. Maybe it's a monthly thing or a weekly thing. Maybe it's a daily thing that we have to forgive a transgression. But that we would cling to your love and your mercy in a way that would extend out even to those that don't deserve it, because we recognize that we don't deserve it. God, I lift up the names and the instances that are being brought to mind, that are on the minds of all of us here, even people on my mind right now, that I think, God, please help me forgive them. God, we turn these over to you, trusting and knowing that this is possible in your hands. That's because you've brought your kingdom here. It's not an earthly thing to forgive in this way. It is a kingdom mindset that we can forgive with your grace and your power. And we cling to that and we claim that today, Lord. In your name, Jesus. Amen.